Good evening, Erev Tov. Thank you very much, Doron. Tonight is the exciting launch of a new series of Zoom events of the National Library's Global Forum. A few words on the Global Forum. It is a vital component of the reinvention of the National Library, designed to transform what was once only a cloistered academic institution into a vibrant cultural center that will play a significant role in the intellectual life of Israel, the Jewish people, and the larger global community. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Moshe Halbertal, the chair of the Global Forum and the moderator of the series. Moshe Halbertal is the Bruce Professor at NYU Law School, the John and Golda Cohen Professor of Jewish Thought and Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a member of Israel's National Academy for Sciences and the Humanities. Among his many books on Jewish law, Jewish philosophy, ethics, and religion are People of the Book, Canon, Meaning, and Authority, published by Harvard University Press, Maimonides, Life and Thought, and The Beginning of Politics, Power, and the Biblical Book of Samuel, both published by Princeton University, and his latest book, Nachmanides, Law and Mysticism, which will be published by Yale University Press at the end of September 2020. And I will add as a personal note that I have been very fortunate to count myself among one of many Halbertal students, studying with Moshe first at the Harvard Law School in 1997, and then later here as a doctoral fellow in Jerusalem. Our speaker tonight is the distinguished philosopher, Professor Michael Sandel. Professor Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard University. His writings on justice, ethics, democracy, and markets have been translated into 27 languages. Titles include Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy, published by Belknap Press of Harvard University, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, Cambridge University Press, and Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, by Farrar, Straus, and Giraud. His course, Justice, is the first Harvard course to be made freely available online and on television. It has been viewed by tens of millions of people around the world, including in China, where Sandel was named, quote, the most influential foreign figure of the year. He was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012. Gentlemen, the Zoom floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Raquel, for your warm introductions, and congratulations for your new position. It's really wonderful. And Michael, this is a great honor to have you as our first conversation in times of crisis. You have been a friend and a teacher and such an important voice in the generation of political theorists and philosophers. So many thanks for joining us.
Well, my pleasure, Moshe. My pleasure.
I want to begin our conversation with the assumption of this whole series, which is the following. Pandemic has this quality of, I would say, like an X-ray. It's a way of revealing so many things about us. One thing is the things we took for granted in times of normalcy. You realize so many things that we're missing, maybe things that we didn't have enough gratitude or didn't care for enough in times of normal conditions. But even more so, it reveals our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities. It's in the Greek, apocalypse means the unveiling, the removal of the cover. So there is I think this is a moment that we learn so much about us, both our weaknesses and strength, and I want to use this opportunity to engage you in your way in which you see the reality, how you interpret it. What is it that you learn for the human condition, politics, society? The other thing I think, which is no less of importance, is in the Jewish tradition, such crisis is always accompanied by fasting, and Maimonides says in the laws of fasting, Taniyot, he says that it always has to be accompanied by repentance, by reckoning. So that moment of crisis is also a time for asking, what ought to be done. Maimonides says it's by way of cruelty to say, well, things just fatalism has a cruelty to us. So what is our responsibility in this period? So our conversation is based on these two aspects of the moment. And I want to start with asking you, what is it that we learn from this unveiling, from this moment in which so much is revealed about us? And I'm speaking mainly about concerns that you always had about issues of justice, distribution, dignity, other concerns of you as a political philosopher.
Well, thank you, Moshe, for the question and also for the warm introduction. It's really a great honor for me to be joining with you, Moshe, in this conversation, and especially for the National Library of Israel, which is a great institution, and what a privilege to be a part of this new series. And at this moment of crisis, just as you say. I think one of the things, maybe the first impulse we had in learning about the crisis, learning from the crisis, was that the pandemic, the virus, reminds us of our shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. We often heard, especially in the early weeks of the pandemic, the phrase, the slogan, "We are all in this together." We heard this from politicians, from advertisers, from celebrities. We are all in this together. And in many ways, that was a warming, inspiring response to the pandemic because it highlighted our mutual vulnerability and dependence. And we had to protect one another from spreading the virus by staying at home and wearing masks and keeping a social distance. So I suppose you could say that's one moral teaching of the pandemic, that we are all in this together. And yet, there was something in that slogan that didn't ring true, that was hollow, that was unconvincing. Because we know with another part of ourselves that we aren't really all in this together. We experience the crisis of the pandemic in very different ways, depending on where we are and where we sit in the economy and the society. And we know that the sacrifice exacted by the pandemic is not truly shared. And so I suppose the second, and maybe the most important teaching, moral teaching of the pandemic, goes to something you said, Moshe, at the outset, which is that it highlights, it casts in sharp relief a feature of our social and economic and political life that has been present for some time, but that we often ignore, which is that the vulnerabilities that a highlight dramatizes are not distributed equally. And the burden falls disproportionately on those who have been left behind by the economy and the society in recent decades. In a way, the pandemic caught us not only unprepared in terms of public health and protective gear and testing kits, it caught us morally unprepared because it arrived at a time after 4 decades, really, of deepening inequality, a growing divide between winners and losers. And so we can't help but notice that some of us are able, we have some inconveniences, but we're able to work from home, to have meetings on Zoom, to teach classes on Zoom, or to run businesses through video conferencing, whereas there are a great many other people who are making it possible for us to do that, delivering goods or stocking warehouses or driving trucks or caring for the elderly, making home healthcare visits. And so I think this is the deepest moral teaching. It's teaching us something we already know but hadn't fully faced.
So we have, as you say, the burdens of the pandemics are not equally shared, right? It's and we see how it's both racially, class-based. People are exposed in a different way. What is then the source of the problem? And clearly there was decades of an attack on government, on the roles of government, on the power of government, and then government has shown to be very weak in responding to this condition in different countries in different ways. But there is something else going on in the terms of the unequal distribution of burden here that we are encountering. And that maybe also comes together with a different aspect that we have to think about it, which is that we realize in this moment how we are dependent upon so-called essential workers, right? The healthcare system, nursing, people who care for the elderly, delivery people, sanitation workers. So what is it that has shown so wrong about our very structural values that we have to tackle here?
Yeah, it's such an important question.
Right.
You're right. We speak now of essential workers. And most of the people we're referring to, of course, doctors and nurses, who do enjoy social esteem, though in the case of nurses, perhaps insufficient pay and rewards. But the other essential workers you mentioned, delivery workers, workers in the gig economy, for example, sanitation workers, we call them essential because we see how deep is our dependence on the work they do. But the way we've designed our economy, we don't treat them as if the work they did were truly essential. There have been these moments in Europe, in some American cities, perhaps also in Israel, where in the evening at a certain hour, people go to their balconies or to their front doors or to their windows and applaud for essential workers. And we see signs that people post thanking the essential workers. But there is an anomaly. There's a gap between the applause and the signs of thanks for essential workers and the way we've designed our economy. If you look back over the past 4 decades, the people we now call essential workers have largely been excluded from the benefits and the economic gains of all of the economic growth that has resulted from the age of globalization, of market-driven globalization. Almost all of the income gains have gone to those at the top 10 or 20%. Those at the middle or below have seen stagnant wages and in some cases declining wages in real terms.
Right. And you have written about that in your new book that is soon coming out, in The Tyranny of Merit, which I read and I thought is really insightful about this issue as such, right? That we tend to, in this meritocracy, we tend to not describe that much merit to that class of people. We reward merit in a certain degree. So this structure is attached to a certain principle and value dominating our society that has to do with meritocracy, right? So how is this attached to this dilemma?
Right. Well, it's true. It's not only, the problem is not only inequality of income and wealth.
Right.
So that's certainly a problem in its own right.
Right.
But along with the deepening inequality of economic rewards, have come changing attitudes towards success and failure. This is where the values you mentioned, Moshe, come in.
Right.
And somehow during this period of widening inequality, the successful have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve, morally deserve, all of the material rewards that a market heaps upon those who land at the top. And by implication, those who struggle, those who have been left behind, must deserve their fate as well. That's the implication of this meritocratic picture. It's a picture that says those who, the winners deserve their winnings, and therefore by implication, the losers must deserve their troubles, their struggles as well. It's these attitudes toward success and failure that have made the deepening economic inequality all the more galling for those who've lost out. And this, I think, explains the anger, the resentment, the sense of humiliation experienced by a great many working people who sense that elites are looking down on them, that not only the economy, but also the culture have left them behind.
Right. So basically, what we're saying is the following, and there are maybe two arguments here that you're developing. One is to say, look, we look at the market, right? And the market rewards different performances, you know, in ways that it answers needs and aspirations and desires or preferences of different individuals, etc. And it rewards it in a certain way.
Right.
But it's not actually rewarding always things that we think are important for the common good.
Right.
Which means that there should be, when we reward people for work, right, we cannot only reward them according to market criteria. So, for example, in let's say in our case, one way to say is, look, we have to subsidize either via ways of taxing or maybe directly people whom we think essential and important, regardless of what the market decides, because the common good is not completely reduced to preferences of market exchange. I think that will be the case also with teachers, right? I think one issue, I think in Israel, but not only in Israel, is the situation of public education and salaries of teachers. Clearly, teachers are so important for the common good, but the market doesn't reward them in a certain way. And you say, well, that's one issue. So that's an aspect, I guess, that we have to enter and say, look, what we have learned in this case is that there is a huge difference between what we assume essential from the point of view of the common good and from what the market rewards. And that's this is a kind of a blindness of capitalism. It's this kind of freestanding capitalism with no government intervention, or we would say in our political conversation, we have to assume issues of the common good far beyond market forces, and this will be a case. And so I want you to engage with this question. How do we go about changing that in terms of structure of markets, structure of rewards, etc.? The other aspect is, it seems like that we have two issues here. One is, what is it that we consider a merit? Right? We say, well, you know, merit is not only what the market merits, etc., etc. But then there is the whole issue of people who are, I would say, are not even part of the economy, and that's the disabled, other people who life brought them to such a situation in which maybe their contribution is even not essential.
Right.
And the meritocracy tends to blame them, right? I would say, I always think of especially the US, but not only US, it's kind of the biblical religion before the book of Job, right? Where right, you have it's kind of perfect providence. Even you have cancer, that's because you didn't eat well. You had a heart attack because you didn't jog, etc. It's kind of the book of Job, the Bible before the book of Job. So and we have to kind of extract ourselves from that type of view of the human condition. So I want you to address these issues of how to go about it in terms of economic distribution of benefits and other issues. How do you see that?
Right. Well, there's so much there in what you said, Moshe. Let me begin with the first,
right.
Which is, which highlights the fact, what you've said highlights
right.
the fact that we have a tendency to assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. This is a very easy assumption to fall into, especially in a capitalist society. But it's a mistake, because even if we had perfect markets, perfect competition, if we're talking about merit, if we're talking about moral desert, we have to ask about the moral worth of the contribution, the moral or social importance of the contribution. Take a concrete example. Take a very successful casino mogul who's become a billionaire by running very successful casinos. Let's assume that he's done it honestly and without corruption. He's made a lot of money doing that. And compare his billions to what a physician makes, or a school teacher, or a nurse. Now, would we really say that the casino mogul makes a contribution to the common good that is truly thousands of times more valuable than that of the physician or the teacher or the nurse? Most people on reflection would say, well, of course not. They might say, but that's how the market works, and so on and so forth. But from a moral point of view, from the standpoint of trying to align rewards with merit, most people on reflection would acknowledge that there is a further question about the moral importance of one's contribution that the market can't answer. And yet, in recent decades, we have tended to outsource our moral judgment about the value of a contribution to markets, which impoverishes public discourse because it deprives us of the chance to reflect and to debate what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. And that means that we can't embody the judgments we make in the system of reward, in the system of taxation, in deciding what industries and pursuits and services to encourage. And it also means that we simply hollow out public discourse and let markets decide these questions for us. I want to come to your mention of Job, because in my book, The Tyranny of Merit, the subtitle I should add is, What's Become of the Common Good? Because viewing merit in the way we've been discussing as simply defined by the money people make in the market, that way of thinking about merit and moral desert encourages the successful to inhale too deeply of their success. It encourages what I call in the book meritocratic hubris among the successful. And the more I believe that my success is my own doing, the less likely I am to consider myself responsible for the fate of those who don't flourish in the economy, because the more likely I am to assume
that they are to blame for their failures. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is how and this is one of the central themes of the book, this is how meritocracy and meritocratic hubris are antithetical to the common good. And so the question you ask is, how can we begin, if that's true, how can we begin to shift morally, culturally, and ultimately in our politics and economic structures? But before we get to those matters, I want to go to the question you asked about Job and about our attitudes toward those who suffer or struggle. Now, in the book, I use the example of Job, and I learned it all from you, Moshe, because you have taught me, just as you said a moment ago, how before the book of Job, the picture we have really is one in the books leading up to, prior to Job, is of a cosmic meritocracy, where everything that happens for a reason. And if people enjoy blessings and good fortune, it's because they've acted well and been faithful. And if they suffer misfortune, then it must be because they've failed in their faith or in their goodness or in their justice. And then the story of Job comes, and what I discuss in the book, having learned from you, is that Job is puzzled because he's in the grip of this picture. He is suffering greatly, and his first impulse is to ask himself, what could I have done wrong? Why is God punishing me? I don't think I've done anything. I think I've led a just life. And his friends, his fellow mourners, as you point out, are encouraging him to think this way. They're saying, you must have done something to deserve this. And then God comes finally and explains that that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Now you can just, you should, let me ask you the question. Why does God say that's the wrong way of thinking about it?
Well, I
think, tell us.
Well, I would say the following, and here comes some of the theme of your book. There is an added evil, I would say. If you come to a person who's suffering, especially if you're a comforter, saying him, not only that you're suffering, you have to be blamed for that. And that form of theodicy has something very perverse in it, right? Say, these are not actually friends who do that, right?
Right.
And Job says, look, one thing I'm not going to accept here. I'm willing to accept my pain, but I'm not willing to accept my guilt.
Right.
And I think when we go back to the issue of the economy, and in some ways, a tendency within American society, but not only, to resist, for example, something that should have happened, healthcare for all, to resist it because those who don't have it are to blame for the fact they don't have it. So there is a breakdown of empathy when that structure of merit really controls the public discourse completely. So
right.
Whatever the reason for, it's a mystery maybe to explain your pain from a perspective of divine providence and justice, but to blame you for your pain is an added evil. It's not an answer to your pain. And I think here it comes very powerfully with what you say. I want to then follow our conversation to the question, and then we'll get through some other justice issues that emerge from the pandemic. There seemed to be a problem besides issues of reward that has to do with the dignity of work, the dignity of labor, right? That we somehow have lost, right? In emphasizing education and saying, you want to succeed, get an education. There is something that we have missed in our culture, a about the dignity of work, the dignity of labor. And this is something you have taught us or thought about that in your book.
Yeah,
How do we restore that? How do we restore that?
right, the dignity of work.
Right.
The dignity of work is implicated in the attitudes we've been discussing.
Right.
And it's undermined, it's crowded out by the tyranny of merit. But we should first take a step back. I think your account of Job and then the connection that I try to make between that story, that meritocratic cosmos, the theodicy picture, there is a deep analogy with the way we think about economic success. There is a movement among some Christians called the prosperity gospel that explains health and wealth entirely in terms of being in divine favor or not, with the dark implication that if you suffer a setback financially or if some ill health befalls you, you need to ask the question that Job's mourners were asking him, I must be to blame. I must be to blame. So this is a harsh ethic, but it's striking that it goes all the way back to the meritocratic theodicy picture that we've been discussing, and it persists, and it comes through certain providentialist traditions in Christianity. It persists very powerfully in our understanding of economic success and economic struggles, this recourse to judgment. So, and this is what makes merit a kind of tyranny. I think it's worth acknowledging that there is something counterintuitive in referring to the tyranny of merit, because we normally think of merit and meritocracy as an ideal of justice, in which people are given jobs and opportunities and college admissions based not on their background or their class or various privileges or nepotism, but simply on the basis of their own individual merit. That seems very attractive. That seems like an ideal. For some, even, it seems the definition of a just way of distributing opportunities and goods and rewards. But what we've seen through this discussion, ranging from the biblical understandings up to the current understandings in the economy, is there is a dark side. And I think we live now under the tyranny of merit. But to go to the dignity of work, it's very difficult to affirm the dignity of the work that most working people are engaged in if you believe that the whole point is to rise by getting a university degree, preferably a prestigious one, to rise into the ranks of the credentialed professional classes. And part of what I think has been so damaging about the attitudes toward merit and success that have developed during this period of globalization is the idea that the remedy to the inequalities created by globalization, the deepening inequalities, the remedy is simply, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, we were all told, you have to get a university degree. Go to college, preferably a brand name one, and then you will be able to compete effectively in this meritocratically competitive economy. And that seems also on the face of it to be encouraging. Who could be against access and encouraging access to higher education? Certainly not you or me. But the dark side is, by creating an economy that makes a higher degree a necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life, that is corrosive of the dignity of work. it says to the majority of our fellow citizens, and we have to remember about 2/3 of adults in the US, in Europe, I don't know the figures in Israel, but about 2/3 do not have a 4-year university degree.
Right.
So it is saying to the majority of the population, the work you do is less valued, which is why I think part of the solution has to be to shift our emphasis away from viewing higher education as the sole condition for dignified work and a decent life, which in no way depreciates the importance, the intrinsic importance of higher education. The mistake is to make it a gateway, to make universities the arbiters of opportunity, because this is deeply antithetical to an appreciation of the various kinds of work that people perform, and it's corrosive of respect for the dignity of work.
Right. So I take, before we move to further issues that are related to your work and the pandemic, I take from our discussion few lessons. First of all is to say what we have learned from this crisis. I mean, following Maimonides' call for reckoning. What we have learned is, one is that the way in which society, markets reward sometimes are very far from what the common good is.
Right.
And we have learned how the dependency on essential workers, et cetera, which means that we have to, through government, through our political conversation, which is not defined by economics, change the structure of reward in these issues. Subsidy for workers, et cetera. Second is that the failure of welfare and public institutions to provide a safety net in terms of public health and other things is in some ways rooted in this perverse idea that the poor are to blame for their condition.
Yeah.
And that created a lack of empathy, right? Which is actually experienced, by the way, when a force comes at us, and it, to a certain degree, exposes us all without any relationship to our virtue or non-virtue, etc. So the second aspect is that issue, strengthening public institutions that provide that safety net when we encounter that, and that they grow out of breaking from the evaluation or the value cage of meritocracy as an idea. I want to then move further to a question that actually arises from other aspects of your work. And I think this is more of a future-oriented question. We are going to have hopefully soon a vaccine, or maybe some other treatments, preventive treatments. And there will be a competition about who gets the vaccine and how. And there are two questions related to justice that arise. The first one is, do you think there should be a market for vaccine? Meaning there won't be enough vaccines to everyone, at least in the first stage. And you would say, well, some companies, for good reasons, after all, they have invented it, et cetera, produced it, they would say, you know, whatever the government gives, etc., there will be a market. So those who have more money will actually be vaccinated sooner. And you have done a lot of work on what should be exposed to market forces. Would you think that will be a fair situation? Should we limit markets in this situation? You ask us all the problem, what money cannot buy?
Right.
Should money buy vaccines, right? Now,
Right.
there is a further question that I want to raise, which has to do with global responsibility, right? You know, now there is a kind of a competitive race between different states to get the vaccine. They will prefer their own, and that's natural, right? So let's assume they will give the vulnerable immediately, those who have background conditions, healthcare workers and others, they will give the vaccine, they will vaccinate. Should they, before they give to the rest of the population, distribute the vaccine globally or not? What is the relationship between caring for your own and your humanitarian general obligations in such situations? So I want to raise these two issues that to a certain degree come to the core of issues you have dealt with and taught us so much about.
Right. Well, these are difficult questions, Moshe. In response to the first, my answer is no, that it should not, access to the vaccine should not be based on money or the ability to buy it. It should not be regarded as a consumer good or as a commodity. Now, I can imagine that some people listening might agree with that, but others might say, but if private companies develop a vaccine through their own investments, shareholder investments and so on, shouldn't they be able to recoup the investments? How else are we going to develop a vaccine?
And also you want to incentivize them to do it, right?
Exactly, yes. To which the answer is, first of all, much of the knowledge, much of the basic research that makes it possible for any company or institution to find a vaccine is publicly funded basic research. So that needs to be recognized. And as far as an incentive, incentives when it comes to life-saving medical care could be regarded simply as a natural extension of the market, or could be regarded morally as a bribe. It might be the case that unless you bribe someone to produce a vaccine or a company, they won't do it. So that would be a kind of way of understanding an incentive. And sometimes you might decide it's worth paying the bribe, but it's important to distinguish between the incentive argument and the moral argument. The incentive argument is just, what do you need to do to get the vaccine you need? And if you need to bribe a company, then maybe all things considered, you bribe them. But that's very different from saying that the right thing to do, or the morally defensible thing to do, is to turn a vaccine into a commodity. Now, so who, if not the company that produces it, should have first access? Well, first access should go, I would say, well, here are among the considerations. Among the considerations are frontline healthcare workers who are protecting others from and treating others, caring for others who have contracted the virus. They should be at the head of the line. Those who are most vulnerable and who would suffer the most serious consequences if they became infected with the virus, they should be at the head of the line. And I would add to these two categories a third. We often overlook. These trials, vaccine trials, are going on even now. We don't pay a lot of attention to who are subjecting themselves to the risks of testing these vaccines. And some of those who are being exposed to those risks of vaccine testing on behalf of the rest of us are volunteers. Some are paid so-called volunteers. But there's a special kind of vaccine trial that is being discussed and considered, so-called human challenge tests, where to speed up the testing, instead of just giving some the vaccine and others not, and waiting to see what happens, that's going to take a very long time. The human challenge trials, you infect the participant in the trial with the virus. Now remember, it'll speed up the discovery of which ones work and which ones don't. But at the moral cost of infecting volunteers, paid or otherwise, with a virus for which we do not have a therapy or a cure. And that raises hard moral questions. However, those moral questions are decided, I would say that those who are undertaking risks to test the drug should certainly be among those toward the front of the line.
Right.
And so that's how I would think about it. What would you say about that, Moshe?
Well, I think all of that makes a lot of sense. You know, I think that this is something we have learned from a common teacher of ours, Michael Walzer, that many times issues of justice are not about having the same amount of money, but it's about blocking the translation of that advantage to other spheres that are irrelevant. I mean,
right.
And here you would say, I mean, and I think making the vaccine a commodity means that your advantages by having money will buy you,
Right.
sometimes at the expense of those that need it more, will buy you an advantage that is actually irrelevant to the advantage of having money. From here, the conception of public good comes in again. So I share with you the idea of kind of blocking market exchanges here in regarding the vaccine. We're going to have to see how it works. It will be a huge challenge because we're going to witness a fierce competition about this limited resource. If it emerges soon, hopefully it will emerge soon, but this will be an issue. I want to come back to the problem, and then we're going to open the conversation to people who have, participants who have questions. In your work, you have given way to preferring your own, some way to a communal obligation based on the idea of solidarity with particular obligations. I mean, it was a critique of a certain Kantian utilitarian idea of that the only rule of justice ought to be universally neutral. And what about the case of here? What will be the limitations on preferring your own in distribution of this good?
In terms of a country?
Yeah.
Well, in general, you're right. I think there is some moral weight to obligations to one's fellow citizens.
Right.
That can be weightier and more demanding than the general moral obligations we have to human beings as such. Right. Not to replace them, but they have a special weight. In the case of a life-saving vaccine,
right,
it's not so clear whether the special obligations of membership, of belonging, of identity are relevant, in that the development of the vaccine itself or the acquisition of it by a country may or may not have much to do with the shared identity of the citizens of that country as in a common project.
Right.
Suppose, for example, and Trump has tried to do this, suppose a German company
right.
develops a vaccine, and Trump, he made an offer of this kind,
right.
has made an offer
right.
to pay a lot of money
to
buy it and give, so that Americans could have access to it first.
Right.
They they didn't let him do that.
Naturally.
But this would be an example of America first. Right. Using America's wealth and might to try to buy privileged access. I think that's a misplaced patriotism, even though, as you point out, I'm not among those who believe that patriotism is a kind of moral weakness that we should ideally overcome with a purely cosmopolitan universal ethic for all purposes. Membership matters, but it matters for purposes that are integral to the character of the community, though.
I see. Yeah.
That's the difference.
Right.
So when Israel does an airlift to rescue Ethiopian Jews and doesn't have the space or the capacity to rescue all Ethiopians suffering from famine, it can be justified as the special obligation that Israel has to rescue the Jewish people.
Right.
That's different from
Right.
Trump buying out a German vaccine company and
Right.
saying, we will use
Right.
it first. That's a misplaced expression, because the financial transaction is not something that grows out of or gives expression to the particular character
Right.
and moral responsibilities
That-
of Americans in this regard.
That's
What
a
do you-
different. I'd say it's an interesting angle, and I would add to that and tell me if you would agree to that. It will be also, if you take the case of Israel and Israel's own idea of itself as assuming a particular obligation to a people and give it some more weight, it will be different when these people are harmed qua members of your community.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So you would say, well, then you have a particular obligation to do that as a member of that community.
Yes.
Let's say for today's, that's also a shocking phenomenon. Let's say a Black person is harmed because of his or her racial identity. You can see a membership obligation stemming from that factor. And one thing that with this pandemic, I mean, one of the, it doesn't harm people qua being member of this group or that group. That might be also another, maybe another.
Well, I think that's I think that's a good distinction, and I think it's a very good articulation of the general point I was trying to make. Neither the acquisition of the vaccine nor the need for it in the first place
has to do
is
with
relevant to the shared character of the community in a way that rescuing a member of the community who has been attacked or injured qua member does engage. And I would add, in the Black Lives Matter protests, I think it's important, I think it's a good example, but I think the example has to be understood as conferring or pointing to a special obligation that Americans of whatever race have to remedy the injustice of racism and segregation, which runs right through American history and traditions and legal practices, and is constitutive of, sadly, what it is to be an American. To be an American is to be implicated morally in the history of slavery and racism and segregation. And so there is a special obligation that Americans of whatever race have to try to address those wrongs.
Right. And I would say one thing with the pandemic, and that comes to your initial statement where you started, right? Our vulnerability, our shared vulnerability, we are all in it, is that the human obligation. The idea is that we are all as humans exposed to that. And there is a way in which, and there are no boundaries here in a deep way, all right? And that evokes a certain love of humanity, if you want to say, a certain idea of the image of God in each of us, that has to trump, has to overcome whatever particular putting ourselves first in this condition of the vaccine. I think this might be a good point to open our discussion to questions, and we have our host to help us in calling for questions from people. So please, we would love to have some of those questions.
Hi, thank you very much. Basically, in the chat room, there's a lot of comments, very many comments and all kinds of remarks. But there are a few good questions. Just a second, please. So Avrom asks, what do we learn? Like war, pandemics bring out the best and worst in people and human nature. Not until we come face to face with our own vulnerability and impending morality Do we really live intensely and meaningfully with heightened awareness of the full value of life?
So maybe to follow up on this question, Michael, and this is something that we are all have struggled with, hard to articulate to a certain degree. This whole problem of life versus the economy. I mean, there is some certain tension here, and different groups actually respond to this question differently. At the beginning, there was a kind of an immense moment, a very powerful moment, where the countries as a whole, there was almost a global reaction saying, we put life first, right? We know that this pandemic is really much more dangerous to a particular vulnerable group, age-wise, background condition, etc. But in order to protect that vulnerable, we stopped the economy. And it was actually remarkable, and it was on the other side remarkable or sad how this idea or this sensibility cannot be sustained through time, or they immediately eroded in different ways. So that relates to the question as well, the value of life, markets and other things. Do you have some thoughts about that?
There have been attempts to try to think about the trade-off between lives and the economy by finding a common metric. So when this debate began, the impulse of those who wanted to open more quickly was to try to calculate or speculate how many people would die as a result of not being able to work, or as the result of the depressing circumstances of being isolated at home, so that to translate into a common measure of value, a metric, whether money or lives lost, the economic activity with life. And I think this is a mistaken impulse. It's an understandable one, because this seemed to be the right way to frame the question. As a practical matter, it turned out that the premature opening of the economy in many areas not only was costly in lives lost needlessly, but it also set back the economy, the ability to reopen the economy, and for that matter, schools. Schools could have been reopened most likely safely now had the shutdown been more consistent and been conducted earlier. So, but I think that even acknowledging the moral choice to be made, it's a mistake to strain to try to find some shared metric. And what instead we have to ask, what is an economy for, really? And in some cases, those most eager to reopen prematurely were those who were benefiting disproportionately from the stock market or from the economy as it was configured. And so that suggests the importance of asking what kind of economy to reopen and how should it allocate the benefits and burdens, the risks and the opportunities. And that's a question we haven't really addressed. I'm hoping that the pandemic will prompt us to ask that question and to debate it.
Very deep question, very deep questions, yeah. Any further questions? Because that prompted a questions I have, but let's see further questions.
While we're waiting for the next question, I did notice, just glancing at this very long list of questions, someone pointed out that Jonas Salk did not patent or benefit economically from the polio vaccine. And so there's an example, maybe it seems like an example from another era, of someone responding to the kind of ethic that we were discussing earlier.
Yes. What a remarkable person, right? And it shows that this issue is not only a matter of policy, but it's a matter of general culture and evaluation.
Yeah.
That has to do with a different atmosphere.
Yeah.
Which is so hard to transform in a society. But that's definitely a very powerful moment. Very powerful moment. Yes.
Yes, there were a few comments on that subject, and also about the fact that he tested it on himself and his family first, and there were a lot of references to that. Ellie asked a question: does the existence of national health programs, such as in the UK, eliminate the moral question of access to the vaccine market? The decision is removed from the free market.
Yes, I would say yes, I would say that is the way that these decisions should be made. And it is made much easier if one has either a national health system or a single payer healthcare system where everyone has access. And then the community as a whole has to decide the question that Moshe and I were discussing earlier: what categories of need are the greatest and should be met first. But medical need should be the basis of distribution of a scarce medical vaccine or therapy, not other considerations, including the ability to pay.
Yes, so Lawrence commented on that. He said, I don't see why this is a bribe. Why not combination? Company can sell it while governments make it available to vulnerable and deserving, and pays companies for vaccines to distribute, type of public-private. As you saw, Sandy wrote, why not look at the polio pioneers as one of the most recent in our time situation for similar nature. Janine said prize is a better word than bribe. And then Nancy said, I understand that in China they use, okay, she goes into the whole using prisoners as human test subjects. And then what I said about the polio vaccine as he tested it on himself and as a family.
Well, just to respond to the suggestion that a private company could sell the vaccine to the government and then the government could distribute it, that's fine, provided that the terms of the sale are fair and in line with their costs of development, and that there isn't a kind of windfall profit that goes beyond that. But as far as providing a reasonable return on legitimate investment, that's a perfectly reasonable way of proceeding.
So, Michael, I want to end our conversation with the following thought and question. That's in particular, I think, talks to the Israeli condition. I think the pandemic as a kind of a X-ray exposed a lot of issues, a lot of concerns about Israeli society in terms of public trust, in terms of government leadership, and other issues. That will take us to a whole other question. I mean, for me, it's almost like the Yom Kippur War in terms of the effect of what it reveals about us and the reckoning we have to do. Now I'm talking about as an Israeli citizen. But I want to ask something that political theorists, philosophers have to maybe deal with, which is, what is it that can a government demand from its citizens at such a moment? The type of, so let's take the following example. There is a huge demonstrations every Saturday night, not huge, but quite big, of, against the government in Israel. They expose a certain risk. Then you have synagogues. There was a whole issue of, traveling to Uman to daven in Rosh Hashanah, Breslav Chassidim, whatever you think about this practice. What is the level in which, the way you see it, in which constraints on basic liberties can be imposed in such moment of crisis? Clearly, by the way, there is always a window of abuse. We know that, of emergency. and emergency powers. The whole history of totalitarianism is a story of abuse of emergency to gain powers in a disproportionate way. How do you think about this issue in facing that moment?
Right. Well, these are deep and difficult questions that don't admit of an easy answer. There are those who say that the requirements to wear a mask outdoor in public
Right.
violates their liberty.
Right.
And there actually one more dangerous violation of liberty that we may agree to temporarily that is getting less attention are the surveillance powers associated with location, the use of cell phone data, location tracking to enforce stay-at-home orders in some countries and to do contact tracing. Now, contact tracing is very important. And so we may decide as democratic citizens to allow the government or private companies working with the government to keep track of where we go and who we see. But that is a lot of data, including sensitive data, personal data, that companies and governments now are becoming accustomed to gathering and using. And of course they say, well, once the pandemic is over, of course, we won't do it anymore. But it's not so clear we'll be able to disassemble that mechanism of surveillance. So this is
and they cannot control the data. The data,
right.
they don't have this way to control it. You know, there are other people who can mine it very easily.
Yes. Yeah. So this, it seems to me, is a more consequential sacrifice of liberty than the requirement to wear a mask. Because when the pandemic ends and if I can take the mask off, I can do that myself and I'm aware of it. Whereas who knows what's become of that data and the machinery of surveillance. That said, I think there is a broader issue that is an appropriate one maybe for us to end on, which is the concept you mentioned, Moshe, that arises in all of these debates about the role of government in confronting the pandemic. And that's trust.
Right.
One of the ways, and this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, one of the ways that the pandemic arrives at a time when we are morally ill-prepared. We spoke about the deep inequalities, but we also live in deeply polarized times, rancorous, partisan, polarized times with very low levels of trust of government, of politicians, of political leaders, of big companies, and even of one another.
Media.
The media. And so going back to your image of the X-ray, the pandemic is an X-ray that reveals us to ourselves. Perhaps what the pandemic highlights most of all is how empty is the reservoir of trust in our societies.
Okay.
This has made it more difficult to deal with the pandemic as a practical matter. But it also suggests one of the biggest moral and political challenges democracies face in contending with the crisis, but also in emerging from it, with democratic norms and institutions intact. That may be our biggest challenge, the challenge of how to rebuild trust, civic trust, trust in one another, and in institutions. And so I would say that that is the biggest unfinished business, the biggest challenge that this moment of crisis reveals.
Well, Michael, thank you so much. Your wisdom, your clarity, the depth of your thinking has made an immense contribution in so many areas of political theory and thought, and also in reflecting on the contemporary crisis. I think this is really the purpose of this conversation, and the purpose of the Global Forum of the Library is really all about that. It's allowing for deep discussion, for coming back to our basics, of our basic convictions and values, and trying to think whom we are as people, and how do we engage with such challenges above transcending the mere rancorous political struggles and other issues. So I'm really thanking you for your contribution in this conversation and for contribution in large. And thank the audience as well for their questions. There are so many comments. I'm going to read them at the end just to learn from. I've seen, as we were talking, different comments. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank the library for providing the platform of this conversation, and thanking Raquel for hosting us in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to join the thanks to you, Professor Michael Sandel, and to you, Professor Moshe Halbertal. And I want to remind our audience that this is the first of a series of 4 Zoom events, and the second one will be on Sunday, September 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. Israel time. The guest will be Thomas Friedman, and the subject will be the challenges of cooperation and adaptability in times of pandemic. You can register on the library's Reading Room online platform. Next events will be with Professor Eva Iluz, and finally with Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, all hosted by our wonderful friend of the library, Professor Moshe Halbertal. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to my colleague, Doron Levin, and to all of you. Have a good evening.
Thanks. Thank you.
Microphones are released so people can say thank you. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening. See you in our next event.
Moshe from Baruch in Toronto. Really good to see you, and thank you very much.
Oh, Baruch, good to see you. Wonderful.
K'tiva v'chatima tova.
To you too. To you too. To you too.
New York City, thank you.
Oh, good to see you. Thanks.
Silicon Valley. Thank you. Dora.
Professor Sandel, just wonderful to listen to you, following up on the article and looking forward to the book.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Moshe. Take care of yourself.
Hi, fine. Good to see you. Wonderful.
Regards to Toby, take care and be well.
Thanks. Thank you.
From New York, thank you so very much. It was very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much from Santiago de Chile. It was great. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you from Los Angeles.
Wonderful.
Very nice.
Thanks.
Hey, Larry.
Hi, thanks from Montreal.
Thanks.
Hopefully we'll see each other in person.
Right. Good to see you.